So Ken Arrow set himself a challenge. What kinds of social choice functions that represent democratic processes might there be that aggregate individual preferences over social states into a social preference over those social states that can help us determine which social state to implement? So how would he go about solving that challenge? Well, he began by observing that there are certain common sense conditions that any social choice function like this must satisfy. And he came up with 5 of those. The first of them he called universal domain. And it's called universal domain because it's an assumption about the domain of this function, the individual preferences of the citizens. And Arrow simply observed that we can't control what kinds of preferences people have, so we should allow them to have the preferences that they have. In other words, individuals can have any rational preferences over these social states. Any set of preferences that would allow them to actually rank the social states and make choices. The second assumption he called Pareto Unanimity. And it simply says that if everyone in the society agrees that the social state A is better than the social state B, then the social preferences should respect that unanimity. The social preferences should also choose A over B. So, if everyone agrees that A, the social state A, is better than B, then the social preferences should rank A over B. Unanimity should be respected. The third assumption he called rationality. We want social preferences that can actually help us choose an outcome. And so we want social preferences to be rational. So social preferences should be rational. And by rational, we simply mean what we meant by rational when we first started to talk about consumer preferences. They should satisfy completeness and transitivity. That is to say, the social preferences should be able to rank any two social states. And if A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C, then A is preferred to C. If social preferences violated this rationality assumption, they wouldn't allow us to make choices. Or, at the very least, they would give someone the opportunity to manipulate the kinds of choices we implement by simply stopping the comparisons and saying, well, A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C, so we should choose A, never mind that C is actually preferred to A. So in order to make choices, we have to insist that those social preferences are in fact rational. The fourth assumption is perhaps the least well understood, and it's called independence of irrelevant alternatives. And it simply says that in the comparison of the social state A to B, how people feel about other social states should be irrelevant. So, when society chooses between a social state A and B, individual preferences over other alternatives are irrelevant. And again, it's an assumption that helps ensure that that social choice process can't be manipulated easily. If how we as a society feel between A and B depends on how people feel about something that's completely irrelevant to that choice, then someone could raise these other possibilities and change how we feel about A and B when all of that other stuff doesn't matter. So that assumption is called independence of irrelevant alternatives. And in the final assumption, he called the no dictatorship assumption. In other words, we don't want a social preference ordering that simply implements the preferences of a single individual. In fact, he made this assumption even stronger. He said we don't want an individual who disagrees with everybody else to always get his way. We don't want someone who, no matter what other people's preferences are, always gets his preferences to be the social preferences. We want a democratic process, at least to some extent. So those were the 5 conditions that he said should be met by any social choice function. So what was his theorem? Well, his theorem then can be phrased in 2 different ways. One way to phrase the theorem is to say, if a social choice function satisfies conditions 1 through 4, then it must violate condition 5. That means if we have a social choice process that satisfies universal domain, Pareto unanimity, rationality, and independence of irrelevant alternatives, then we have no choice but to appoint a strong dictator, a dictator who always gets his way, even if he's the only one who prefers A to B, and everybody else disagrees, A is ranked over B. The second way of phrasing the theorem is to say there is no social choice function that satisfies assumptions 1 through 5. There simply is no such process. So what does that mean? It means we don't have some ideal way of aggregating individual preferences over social outcomes, some ideal way that results in a will of the people that's coherent in any sense. There are no political institutions that will give rise to a will of the people that satisfies these conditions. Does that mean that Ken Arrow was opposed to democracy and said, well, since we like the first 4 conditions, we need to appoint a dictator that just determines everything? Far from it. Ken Arrow believed deeply in democracy and democratic processes. What he said was that we have to actually study democratic institutions and processes, because what comes out of those institutions depends on how those institutions are set up, how they're governed, what rules they follow, what the constitutions are, and so on and so forth. These things matter, and they have to be studied. Just as in the first welfare theorem, he pointed out all the conditions that are required for markets to result in efficient outcomes, and thereby challenged economists to study what happens when those conditions are violated. He's challenging political scientists to study political institutions and their consequences. There is no ideal political institution, there is no ideal social choice function that satisfies all of these conditions. So we are left with politics being messy and trying to find political institutions that can restrain the messiness and can get us towards outcomes that we think are better. It was also a caution to economists. Just because economists come up with some policy that they think is wonderful, doesn't mean that there's a social choice function that'll simply implement that policy. Political institutions matter. And so just because we see something that might be wrong in the world, doesn't immediately mean we can implement the solution we think will fix it. We have to study political processes that can help us figure out how to get to the point where we'd like to end up. So that was his basic message. Now the theorem itself is not terribly difficult to prove. It's a little bit too difficult to prove to do it in this class. But if you're really interested, go to part B of chapter 28 and you'll find the proof.